Soon, I'll tell you something that will make you wonder if such things are still possible today. You'll wonder how a man who is the head of a billion-dollar company in front of everyone's eyes could have such a dark side. Jan Marsalek was born in Vienna in 1980. He had a relatively normal childhood, but his family relationships weren't great. Although this photo of him posing like a secret agent paints a happy picture of his childhood, his life would take a very, very different turn from where he started. He didn't actually have a bad family, but that wasn't enough to keep Jan from distancing himself from them. According to his mother, he was a conceited type. He must have thought high school was too simple because he dropped out before graduating, left home, and jumped straight into the working world. Jan was someone who had big dreams in his early youth and could easily influence those around him. He briefly tried to start his own e-commerce software company and had already taken his first steps into entrepreneurship at that young age. But while he was doing these things, other events were unfolding in another country, Germany, that would shape his life. Founded in Munich in 1999, Wirecard was a new financial technology company that aimed to supposedly facilitate credit card payments on the internet. In the early days of the internet, most money circulated in the gambling and adult content industries, so Wirecard would become a star in this market. The company's business was simple but effective. They ensured that payments made with Visa and MasterCard for gambling and pornography appeared on customers' statements with a more innocent description. Essentially hidden, Wirecard had begun to grow rapidly with this seemingly innocent service, even though there were plenty of obscene and gambling-related websites, places where money was spent discreetly, and a lot of content to hide. The company's founder and CEO, Marcus Braun, was a Viennese KPMG consultant, essentially a tax auditor. Interestingly, he always wore black turtleneck sweaters and, for some reason, projected an image similar to Apple founder Steve Jobs. Unfortunately, he would not be as influential or memorable as Jobs, and on the contrary, would perhaps be seen as a naive man in the future. But he was not a foolish man either. So much so that he noticed a young man named Jan Marsalek, who was entering the world of entrepreneurship in his home country of Austria. He even persuaded him to transfer to his own company, Wirecard, at the age of 20. It is unknown what Marcus saw in him, but this remarkable young man, who did not even have a high school diploma, was quickly promoted to CTO at the rapidly growing company. In other words, he was put in charge of the company's technology. However, I cannot say what this move meant for Wirecard or Marcus, but it would not be a good sign. As soon as Jan took office, he made his move and redirected all of the company's internet traffic to his own computer instead of the server computers. This allowed him to directly monitor internal company communications. He could see who did what and what they shared. In a way, he had Wirecard in the palm of his hand. The employees, meanwhile, were content to watch the situation unfold, trying to figure out what was going on. He hadn't exactly elevated the company with his arrival, nor had he come up with any tangible projects. The process and the idea were good from the start. Therefore, it was enough for Jan to appear to be doing something and for Marcus to be convinced. Because Wirecard continued to grow day by day. For example, he had been talking about developing revolutionary software for more secure payment transactions within the company for months. He had motivated the sales team to sell this imaginary product and had even made deals with some customers. However, there were only a few pieces of code on display, but ultimately the graph was pointing upwards. Meanwhile, the company had expanded its global reach by acquiring small payment companies and prepaid card companies abroad. Or at least that's what was being said to the public. Because when these companies were traced, there was generally little evidence of Wirecard's supposed growth. A business partner in Bahrain was actually a sign shop. In a poor town in England, there was a simple sole proprietorship set up in someone else's name. The other so-called major partner in the Philippines turned out to be a family living in a villa and grooming dogs. However, even before these revelations came to light, the manipulations applied to Marcus had worked. And Marcus had increased the company's value by promoting Jan's so-called major moves in the global market to the public. So in my opinion, these were manipulations, and they were all Jan's idea. Because before he arrived, the company was operating quite legally, but after Jan arrived, they announced to the market that we were growing and globalizing, and with these lies, they had inflated the company's share value and fake balance sheets to incredible figures. Jan leaves and finds a random store in a random country. He says, "Let's present this as our company's new major partner." Marcus, the owner of the company, also came out and advertised this, attracting a lot of investment from the public. In short, the company was inflating its balance sheet and cash reserves on paper. It was growing rapidly by presenting money that did not exist as if it did. When things were going so well, in his 10th year at the company, in 2010, Marcus promoted him to the position of deputy CEO. Wirecard's global operations, especially its ventures in the Asian market, were now directly and entirely his responsibility. People attributed his rise to such a position at such a young age, without even a degree, to his charisma. This charisma was not the charisma of attractiveness. It was charismatic leadership in the business world. His intelligence, self-confidence, and influential demeanor set him apart. He was in contact with governments and large companies in Asia and other regions. He was involved in big deals worth millions of euros, sometimes legitimate, sometimes through the illegal methods I mentioned. However, behind all these dazzling successes, he was being dragged towards an unpredictable point where one might say he was no longer there. While rising in his career at this young age, Jan Marsalek had also begun to develop mysterious passions and dangerous connections. His position at Wirecard afforded him a luxurious lifestyle. He attended parties in St. Tropez. One day, he went to Munich and spent 15,000 euros in a single night on lavish meals. He consumed the most expensive drinks. But while living this life, he seemed to be driven by another urge that grew within him day by day. He tells stories to those around him as if they were straight out of spy movies. He acted as if he possessed secret knowledge. In other words, he behaved not like a businessman, but like a secret state official. However, by the early 2010s, his focus had shifted to Russia. Wirecard was looking for an opportunity to enter the Russian market, and to this end, contacts had been established with the bureaucracy in Moscow through certain political figures. Thus, he began to travel to Russia frequently from 2010 onwards. So much so that in some months he flew to Moscow 4 to 5 times. For example, John himself was at the forefront of negotiations with Russia's telecom giant Megafon to set up a contactless payment system in the Moscow metro. However, by 2013, this project had failed for various reasons. Of course, he hadn't realized that something else had already sprouted in place of this opportunity he thought he had lost. Because at that very moment, a mysterious woman named Natalia Zlobina had entered John's life. This woman, who would be in her late 20s, tall and blonde, a true Russian lady, was initially introduced to John as a businesswoman with influential connections in Moscow's bureaucracy. However, Natalia was a woman who had starred in erotic films in the past, had been prominently featured for her beauty, and had made a living off that beauty. But contrary to all this, she would turn out to be someone very different, though not entirely untraceable. According to reports, she was actually connected to Russian intelligence and had been specifically assigned to get close to him. In fact, the deletion of Natalia's passport information and travel records from official Russian records indicated that she was someone who was quite heavily protected by the state. So it seemed that a beautiful woman was needed to seduce John and use him for the benefit of Russian intelligence, and Natalia fit that description quite well. Jan, who knew nothing about it, and the stunning Natalia met in 2013. Naturally, this meeting quickly turned into a relationship. In fact, it seemed that Jan had fallen in love with Natalia, so now his priority was his girlfriend rather than his job at Wirecard. Natalia, even though you couldn't see her at the time, was like the attractive female spy characters in spy movies. The couple started traveling together frequently, flying by private jet from Moscow to Barcelona and then to Santorini. For Jean, it was all like a dream. Of course, all expenses were covered by the company. Occasionally, work was necessary, and when it was, Natalia didn't hesitate to bring John into her so-called business circles. In the summer of 2014, at a luxury yacht party held for Natalia's birthday in the port of Nice in southern France, a man appeared. Natalia introduced him as Stas and emphasized his importance by calling him a general. This person, Stas, was Stanislaw Petlinsky, the dark side of the Russian security world. He had served in the Russian Special Forces in the 90s and then worked in the presidential administration at the Kremlin. Rumor had it that although unofficially, he had connections with more than one Russian secret service. In other words, this man was exactly who Jan had wanted to be as a child. In fact, from the moment they met, our guy was fascinated by him. But the acquaintance that began that night would turn Jan's whole life upside down. In fact, according to those who knew him, Jan would change so much that people would refer to him as Jan before Stas and Jan after Stas. Stas immediately recognized the potential in him, or perhaps he had been the target from the very beginning. Was Jan interested in weapons? Stas took him to shooting ranges and had him undergo firearms training. Was our guy curious about the dark world of the Russian deep state? Petlinsky had an answer for every question and an acquaintance who could open any door. Starting in the summer of 2014, Marsalek gradually began to become a pawn in the Russian intelligence service's efforts to establish a money laundering network. I don't think they knew it, but he wasn't going to remain just a pawn. Jan had also gradually become involved with the Russian Internal Intelligence Service, the FSB. On the surface, he was a senior executive at a German company listed on the stock exchange. But over time, and especially with Natalia's generous contributions, he had become a secret agent working behind the scenes on behalf of the Kremlin. And he wasn't the only one, of course. He had become a tool at Wirecard, which he had taken complete control of: money laundering, mercenary payments, illegal fund transfers. Thus, Wirecard's name would be associated with intelligence as much as finance in the future. Of course, Jan's friendship with the general had also progressed quickly. Our guy was doing everything he could to impress this charismatic, mysterious man, closing down expensive restaurants and listening to his every word with his mouth agape. Natalia, meanwhile, was egging him on from behind as he got more and more into his spy persona. He was meeting influential figures in Russia. He was diving deeper into the dark world. She didn't even miss the chance to fly in a fighter jet with her chatty boyfriend. While he was a white-collar guy, he was living in a fantasy world. Meanwhile, the general's office was right across from the Russian consulate in Munich. He often held secret meetings in this office with high-ranking figures from Russia, trying to act like an important person to justify his role as a pawn. Over time, he also had the opportunity to meet the real villains rather than just these agents and bureaucrats. One day, Anatoly Karazi, wearing a Hells Angels gang t-shirt, came to one of these meetings. This man was a member of Wagner, Russia's largest and most terrifying mercenary army. Remember that guy who tried to stage a coup against Putin in 2023 and supposedly crashed his plane by accident? Yevgeny Prigozhin. So Wagner's manager was this guy whose plane was going to crash in the future. And wherever there was a shady assassination job, Wagner was there, and this guy Anatoly that Jan met was the head of Wagner's intelligence. So he was the kind of dangerous and formidable acquaintance who knew about the guy who escaped from the plane. Perhaps we are talking about a man just below someone who could stand up to a man like Putin. So Jan, how did you get here? Are we watching a spy movie? What kind of network is this? I honestly don't understand it myself. But these two had also become close friends. On May 5, 2017, Wagner's intelligence chief Anatoly flew from Moscow to Munich to meet with Jan. The pair flew to Beirut on a private jet, met with General Stas there, and crossed into Syria together. Palmyra was in the midst of a fierce battle at the time, with the Russian army and Wagner mercenaries fighting against ISIS and rebels. Actually, there were two reasons for taking him there. One was to get him fired up, to send the message, "We're bringing you this far. We can even put you in the middle of the war. You're important." The other reason was darker. While he was there, they gave Jan weapons and recorded him firing them. To him, these were memories recorded for fun, but those who recorded them had other intentions. The sight of a high-level executive of a multinational company in Syria, illegally, with weapons and rockets in his hands, would not be beneficial to the company or to him, of course. And although Jan didn't care much about those recordings at the time, Wagner now had leverage. But aside from that, our guy was now fully immersed in the atmosphere of military espionage. So Russia had found itself a clean-cut European citizen, a multinational company executive capable of laundering money who would say yes to anything. Don't ask what Libya had to do with it. It was the new target. Jan had come from the business world and somehow got caught up in the idea of becoming a player at the state level. After returning from Syria, Jan now truly believed himself to be a statesman. In 2017, he hosted Kilian Kleinschmidt, an experienced crisis management expert who had worked at the United Nations, at a luxury restaurant in Munich, and asked him to prepare a feasibility report on Libya. He offered him 200,000 euros in return. However, his request that the invoice be issued in the name of the Russian-Libyan Cultural Institute in Moscow was a clearer indication of who was actually behind the request. In 2011, Libyan leader Gaddafi was captured and the country was divided in two. The Russians also wanted a piece of this pie. They were using our fork as well. But this plan would fall apart when he made a small change to the side plan and told Kilian about it. According to Kilian's later statement, he wanted to establish a special army of about 20,000 people made up of militias in Libya. This army would protect the border of the Sahara Desert and prevent the flow of migrants from Africa to Europe. Moreover, these militias would be equipped with the latest technology. Small cameras would be attached to their uniforms. Why? Because our newly appointed agent would use these cameras to broadcast the war live and let people place bets on it. Yes, you heard right. He had a project in mind where a live broadcast would be streamed from the camera on the soldier's uniform, and people would bet on things like whether the soldier would survive or who would win the shootout. And you straight-laced white-collar worker living in a fantasy world, they said if you give that kind of authority to someone who runs to the salt shaker at the drop of a hat, this is what happens. If you give an inch, they'll take a mile. But fortunately, Kilian rejected the offer after hearing this and left the table, never to return. Of course, the bell would soon start tolling for this focused agent, who saw the world as nothing more than a stage for his games. By 2018, Wirecard had become one of Germany's most prestigious companies. Its stock market value exceeded 24 billion euros. However, this growth had begun to attract the attention of some journalists and investors. In particular, a Financial Times reporter noticed inconsistencies in the company's financial reports. In early 2019, reports were published alleging that false accounting records were being kept in an illegal office in Singapore. Naturally, the company's CEO, Marcus, and our Jan denied these allegations, but the media slowly began to get angry. Even the German government said that these reports were unfounded and that the company proudly represented the country. But no one, not even Marcus, knew about Jan's actions. However, the facts were now too big to ignore. There was a huge black hole in Wirecard's accounts, and news like this was beginning to surface with evidence from journalists as the days passed. The billions of euros appearing on the balance sheet in the Asia-Pacific region managed by Jan were not actually real. 3 companies, El Alam in Dubai, Senjo in Singapore, and PayEasy in the Philippines were used to inflate Wirecard's revenue. Transactions involving these companies were shown as profits in Wirecard's coffers, but the money was nowhere to be found, and these reports began to destroy first the company's stock value and then the company itself. Thus, in 2020, this illusion came to an end. On June 18, 2020, an independent auditing firm refused to approve Wirecard's accounts due to a significant loss of $1.9 billion. In other words, this amount appeared to exist on paper, but there was no real money behind it. Only the figures written by Jan existed. The company had objected, claiming they kept the money in a bank in the Philippines, but the institution had been contacted, and the bank had stated categorically that no such money existed with them. In the meantime, the company's CEO, Marcus Bruin, resigned the next day and was arrested shortly thereafter. Wirecard shares plummeted, and within just a few days, the company filed for bankruptcy. officially signing off on Germany's biggest financial scandal in history. But beyond this scandal, everyone had one question on their minds. What had happened to the money? Where was the company's second-in-command, Jan Marsalek? The most shocking element of the Wirecard scandal was the missing money and its manager. This money was shown in accounts in the Philippines. Yet even the Philippine Central Bank was baffled. The banks in question had stated that this amount had never existed. As German prosecutors deepened their investigation, all eyes turned to Jan Marsalek, because the trail of the missing money led directly to operations he managed. But unlike CEO Marcus, Marsalek did not surrender immediately. In fact, in the days when the scandal broke, he told those around him that he was going to the Philippines to find the missing money. Then on June 23, 2020, he did indeed enter the Philippines, and the next day he passed through China's Guangzhou city. However, it would later become clear that this passage was only on paper. The records at the Philippine Immigration Office were fake. Marsalek had never been to that country. Two officials confessed that they had entered these entry and exit records into the system in exchange for money. John, meanwhile, was in the midst of his plan to make a clean getaway amid the chaos created by COVID. On June 19, 2020, he flew from a small airport in Austria to Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, on a private jet in the midst of restrictions. He then arrived in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. He was wanted on a red notice. However, thanks to his close connections with Moscow, he encountered no obstacles at the border. He then quietly made his way to Moscow using false names and fake IDs. This was the last place he could be officially tracked. Nothing more would be heard from him. Both the unknown money and he were lost. Western countries had launched a global search through Interpol and a red notice. It was known that he had entered Moscow, but Russian officials had not officially acknowledged Jan's presence. In 2021, the investigative journalism group Dossier Center revealed that Jan had long since acquired Russian citizenship. Moreover, he possessed a Russian passport issued under the name German Bazanov, which had granted him legal status in Russia. This was because the passport number was identical to that previously belonging to a Russian parliamentarian. So he could hide anywhere in the country under his parliamentary immunity. This was the clearest indication that he was being protected by the state. It was also alleged that he had a second fake Russian passport in case he was exposed online. All of Europe was searching for him. Photos allegedly of him were appearing in the media, but the truth could not come to light. According to the latest information, Jan was now believed to have assumed a new identity in Russia under the name Konstantin Bazov. This name was not just an alias. There was actually an Orthodox priest with the same name living in the city of Lipetsk, southeast of Moscow. And the priest, strangely enough, looked like Jan's twin. But when contacted, he simply said he couldn't talk about it. In March 2025, last month, British intelligence found hundreds of documents and passports with Jan's photo. When suspects arrested in assassinations in Belgium, France, and Bulgaria were investigated, somehow conversation recordings with his photo under it came up. In fact, let me add a little more to the speculation. According to estimates, he was no longer just a foot soldier for Russian intelligence, but had become its very center. However, this white-collar entrepreneur, despite being behind most of the shady dealings in Europe, still could not be found. Where was Jan? Why did Russia protect him even after the company was gone? What happened to the $2 billion? Was the priest really him? Unfortunately, this has not been revealed to this day. More accurately, how had Jan become such a man? How had the person he dreamed of become a name lost in the shadows? I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please remember that I do all the work on this channel by myself and can only do it with your likes and comments. See you next time, as always, and take care until the next video.